And we'll still have some people coming in.
Here we go. Seattle, Redmond, Washington State. Don Gilmore is in Arlington from Potomac Boat Club. Catherine Capel in New Zealand. Hi, Catherine. She's in Christchurch. You've got up early. Craig Wolf from Boston. Hello. Asheville, North Carolina. Redmond, Washington. Pittsburgh and Orinda, California. Wow, wow, wow.
Maybe we'll hit every continent if we're lucky.
We're missing, the Australians are asleep. Give them a bit of grace. It's 5
Right,
a.m.
that's
now.
true. I know. Well, they row. They can get up early.
Well, the trouble with lockdown is that we get used to not getting up early because you're not allowed to go rowing, so you don't have to be up.
Right, you can row on the erg anytime. So.
Regrettably, that is correct. Yeah. It certainly has made it more challenging for me personally.
Well, you are still in lockdown, aren't you, in Auckland?
We are. There's all sorts of semi-humorous discussions about breaking into the boathouse and liberating some of the boats. Because if you have a private boat and you keep it at home, you can go rowing, but the boat club is not open. I'm just picking up on some of the text chats that people are sending me. People, there's always someone who can't find the link. That's okay. We'll welcome them when they get here.
Just a couple more people coming in. We have 78 people online right now.
There we go. Well, while we're waiting, I can tell you that when I wasn't preparing for the webinar today, I've spent this week doing the 2021 edition of my Rowing Tales anthology book. And I have found the most marvelous illustrator called Rachel Hunt, who I've found on Instagram, who does beautiful, stylized, bright colored illustrations of rowing clubs. So you can commission this picture of your rowing club from her. So I'm seriously looking forward to it. The proofs, I hope, will be going off to the printer later on this week, and then it'll be published in time for Christmas. Plus, as ever, I've got some hilarious stories which people have sent me.
Do you have a story from Volker? Volker, you must have a good story for Rowing Tales.
I did already. I was in the first edition.
Oh, okay. And I'm still dragging my feet.
Obviously, it was not so exciting, so I'm not invited anymore.
You don't have to be invited. If you think that, you've got the wrong message. This is very much a free-for-all. I invite contributions, and sometimes I spot them. A gentleman put a sonnet up on the Facebook Masters Rowing International group literally a couple of days ago. He said it was just buzzing around my head while I was rowing, and I went home and I wrote it, and it became a sonnet. And I can't write poetry, so I was just blown away. Isn't that amazing?
Yep, that's a neat story.
It's certainly a skill I personally do not possess.
Okay, I think we're 5 after. Should we go ahead and start, Rebecca?
Let's start.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the Rigging for Masters webinar. And I'm Marlene Royal, and I'm joined with my co-host, Rebecca Caro.
Hi, everyone.
And we also have Volker Nolte with us. Hello, Volker. And Mike Purser is with us live. And Mike Davenport is our other guest. And Mike is joining us by recorded video because he's actually out on the water coaching right now. And for those of you who are maybe with us for the first time and haven't heard about Faster Masters Rowing, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how we got started. Rebecca started the RowingChat network some years ago. And back in 2006, she invited me on RowingChat for her podcast. And it was the first one we did talking about masters rowing. And that podcast episode was one of the most listened to episodes. So we started thinking about, of course, we need to do more things for masters rowers. And Rebecca has been very involved with masters rowing, and I have primarily coached only masters since 1982. So that first day that we started talking on the podcast was the beginning of the idea of Faster Masters. And basically since then, we've never really stopped talking about masters and coming up with ideas of how we can continue to advocate for masters rowing and promote masters rowing competitively, as well as from the point of view of just aging well and healthy. So in 2019, we got together and started what's now known as fastermastersrowing.com, which is a membership site where each month we post 2 or 3 training programs, the land training programs, a performance article, a technique article or video, and also like a lifestyle wellness topic. And we started the membership site as a way to address often the lack of coaching or ability to have good training plans for masters rowers. And we work on 2 hemispheres. I'm in the Northern Hemisphere and Rebecca's in the Southern Hemisphere. So when we design the programs each year, we're revolving, we choose peak races that are coexisting for both Australia, New Zealand, Britain, England, North America, which is why we often have 2 or 3 different programs running parallel at the same time that we update each month. And we started doing this project in 2009, just before COVID and everybody stopped racing. And out of this grew our podcast, which is Faster Masters Rowing Radio. And originally it was once a month. And when we all went into lockdown for COVID, we started doing it every week. And we were finding that the audience was growing and there were a lot of masters topics to talk about. So we decided to continue the podcast on a weekly basis. So that's what we have continued to do now since 2019. And the podcast is broadcast every Thursday, 6 p.m. Eastern time, except for the first one of the year, which we do a little bit earlier so that we help our European and British listeners listen in their evening time instead of it always being their later time.
First of the month. That's first of the month. Sorry.
First of the month. First week of the month. So kind of shortly, that's how we got started with Faster Masters Rowing. And we have taken on some other projects, and we've started to do some different events. And this is one of them. This is our first one relating to rigging, that we've wanted to bring in guests who are really experts in the field and help us learn better as masters athletes, how we can be more competitive, how can we design training or rigging so that it fits us better, so that we row better. And we've found that there's quite a lot of interest in this type of knowledge. And we hope to do more of these in the future. And I think before I turn it over to Rebecca, I would like to say thank you to US Rowing. US Rowing has been very supportive of us advocating for masters and promoting masters content, and they helped to publicize the event to the US Masters community as well. So we would like to say thank you to them for the support. And I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca now.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I'm also just delighted that this has worked out so well for so many people. Now, the structure of what we have got today is we've actually got 4 speakers, and I'm the first. And I'm going to be talking about the raw basics of rigging and boat adjustment in a club situation, not private boats. So this is when we're using shared boats. Everybody knows that when you get into a boat, before you go rowing, there are various things that you need to adjust in order to be comfortable in the boat. And comfort is the number one reason why we use rigging to adjust the equipment. It doesn't matter whether you're going to go out and try and win a major title, or whether you are a recreational rower who just loves going out for a paddle with your friends. It's important that we understand the basics. And I suspect there are quite a lot of people here who are leaders within their club group who can go back after today to the club group and make some suggestions. Let's start with the real straightforward basics of the boats and oars which your club has. Now, many of us have to share equipment with other training groups. In my own club, we share with the juniors. And so things like oar lengths and inboards need to be set to a standard dimensions so that they're appropriate for use. Fortunately for us, the juniors are not very strong. Some of the masters are not very strong. So we have a mutually agreed oar length and inboard, which we have set for, there's 2 different sets of sweep oars, one for men, one for women, the same for our sculling oars. And we know that these are good for at least 80% of our members. They may not be ideal, but they're good. We choose to label them so that everybody knows the difference between a length and an inboard and what that means on the label. So I will write 286:87, which means 286 centimeters long and 87 centimeters inboard, which is the measurement from the button to the end of the handle. It's the side of the button which is closest to the gate. Other things. Foot stretchers. Everybody needs to know how to move a foot stretcher, not yank it or kick it, undo the nuts, lift it up so it's proud of the sawtooth, which is what clamps the 2 different parts of the foot stretcher together, and to set themselves up. So in sculling, there's enough space at the finish for you to hold your handles with the against your lower ribs. So I'm a woman, so this is, I usually say for women, this is on your bra strap. For guys, I just say, here are my lower ribs. Hold it so the base of your thumb is on your lower ribs. And the gap between your hands needs to be equivalent to either 1 hand or 1.5 hands. What's important is that you can't scull past your body, which is what I'm demonstrating now as I'm moving my hands past my ribs. Everybody needs to understand how to move their foot stretcher so that they can achieve that position. The other thing that people need to be able to do is to adjust the height of the oarlock. So the sill, the base, the lower part of the square of your oarlock is an important measure, because that's where the oar rests when you're holding your handles. If your handles are right up here, the oarlock is too high for you. If you sit with your legs straight, leaning back in your finished position, and you're holding your hands in your finished position with your handles touching your chest, leaning back, and the oar spoon should be fully submerged under the water. That's where you go to in order to test whether you've got enough space at the finish. And to test the height, you sit in the same position. Now, your handles will rise up as you bury the oars. And if they're too high, it's very uncomfortable to row. And so there are some neat devices that can be incorporated into every boat, which are adjustable spacer washers. I've got some examples here. There's an orange one and a yellow one and a red one. And these are actually different widths. So you can see the red one here is thinner than this blue one. So the red one is approximately 5 millimeters. The blue one is nearer a centimeter. And you can put these into the spacers above and below your oarlocks, so that when someone is coming to row and they know that they are more petite or taller and they want more or less height, they can adjust these. So we set our boats up so that there is one spacer above and below every gate, so that people can move them up or move them down. And the idea is that at the end of the outing, you put them back. So everyone knows that the boat is set to have one of the spacers top and bottom. When it comes to setting up your boat for sweep rowing, it's a little harder to judge where to adjust to, for the simple reason that with only one handle, it's more of a judgment call. An experienced rower will know that if they hold their outside arm with their thumb, the base of their thumb on their ribs, that your outside hand, when your elbow is tucked quite close to your body, your outside hand, you should be able to be in it like a straight line here with your elbow going past your body. However, it's easier to measure on the deck a distance behind the pin. So if you pick a straight line, square across the boat from the face of the gate, so that's the vertical part of the gate, which is closest to the pin, so it's not the side where the swing arm closes. You take a measurement from there backwards towards the end of the slides where the rower is sitting. And there's a range of measurements that you can use, but generally 58 centimeters behind the face of the pin for smallish women, up to 62 centimeters for people with extremely long legs. And we measure so that the back of our back wheel of the seat is on the mark. And the way to check that is, again, you sit with your legs straight, your feet in the shoes, and then take your finger and just put it down behind your seat until it's resting in the groove of your slide. And then you can feel exactly where the seat wheel is. Leave your finger there, roll your seat forwards, and then you can look down. And we take tape and we mark it with a permanent marker, and we mark the marks 58, 60, 62. So people have got 3 marks that they can adjust to, or if they choose the intermediate mark, it's pretty easy to judge. Now, when it comes to setting up a boat for a crew, regardless of the height of the different athletes, it's important to try and have your blades parallel. This means compromises are going to be needed. And therefore, my recommendation is that in a crew boat, you adjust so that your blades are parallel at the finish. This again means sitting at the exact same position that I've already talked about, which is legs straight, leaning back in your finish position, blades squared and buried under the water, and your handles at the correct finish height. Someone on the bank can judge whether or not your blades are parallel, and you should then be able to adjust your foot stretchers so that at the finish, you are all at the exact same angle. This may mean that some people have very slightly different finish positions, or you may need to make adjustments on the oars, particularly if it's a regular crew. It's important to get these as finessed as possible. If you're a occasional crew, you may not be able to make permanent adjustments. When it comes to changing the oars, you can change the inboard quite easily with something called a clam, which stands for something which I can't remember. And it's a molded piece of plastic, which you can slide down the handle of the oar to sit next to the bottom. Sorry, let me get this correct. You slide it up from the spoon to sit next to the bottom. This will give you a longer inboard, a shorter outboard, and it will adjust them. They're 1 centimeter thick. Now, that obviously makes your inboard longer. So it's not great for people who are short and of stature and need more space at the finish, but it is an easy adjustment that you can make on the day in the boat. So some people, particularly single scullers, sometimes just keep these. They store them on their oars and they store them on the handle side of the shaft so that if they need them, they can take them off and put them onto the button side between the button and the gate. Another easy adjustment that you can do is to have a seat pad. I've got a couple of different ones here, and this one is 1 centimeter thick. This one is rather thinner, And these will just lift you up a little higher off your seat, particularly if you find that height is a challenge. You don't necessarily need to even tape them into the seat. You can just put them underneath you and it just lifts you up a little bit more. And that gives you a little bit more comfort in terms of your oar heights. Now let's talk about the actual athletes. So the boat and the oars have certain things which are very easy to adjust, either by putting your boat on trestles before you go on the water or actually in the boat when you're about to go rowing or mid-outing. But understanding yourself as an athlete will help you to learn what are appropriate adjustments for you. And your physique is unique. And so this is a thing that only you can check. The first thing you need to know is what is the ratio of your height to your arm span. Everyone's probably seen the Archimedes man in a circle where he's standing with his arms out and his legs splayed. The perfect, in inverted commas, human being in that particular illustration, his height is exactly the same as the measurement from one fingertip to the other when his arms are stretched out. Now, I happen to be exactly that proportion. That's my physique. You can find this very easily. Go to a wall, take one hand, put it on the floor, and then reach sideways with your other hand and reach up on the wall. Mark where your finger is at the full stretch, and then rotate around and put your head against the back of the wall with your legs straight and your heels close to the join with the floor. And you'll be able to see whether or not you are taller or shorter than your wingspan. I used to row with a girl called Jenny, whose arms were 15 centimeters longer than her height, and she was already taller than me. So it was extremely challenging in the boat because she just had a longer reach than I did. So knowing that piece of information will help you to make adjustments in the boat that suit you. But physical limitations come in other forms as well. And it's important that you know what you can do. So your hip mobility is something that you can quite easily test. How easily can you flex at the hips to reach forwards and backwards? Just sit on the floor with your legs straight in front of you, sit bolt upright, and can you rock forwards from that position? Sometimes it's easy to put your hands on your legs and just push your hands down your legs and see how far you can rock forwards with a straight back. If you want, you can then curl your back and see if you can reach further, but that isn't moving your pelvis in the correct way for the rowing stroke. You also need to review your ankle mobility. Just go down into a squat and see how far you can squat down with your heels on the floor and at what point your heels need to rise up. You might find if you move your feet further apart, you can achieve a different result from when your feet are close together. And you also need to consider your body size. Some of us have long torsos relative to our legs. Some people have extremely long thigh bones or shins relative to other parts of their body. Some of us are carrying a bit of a gut around our bellies. And so that means that we're also compromised in those areas. Knowing your individual capabilities will allow you to set up the boat to suit yourself. If you have long legs and a short body, the chances are you might need to lower the height of the oarlocks so that you can have a comfortable finish position. By contrast, if you've got a bit limitation in terms of your ability to rock forwards and backwards, you might find that with a slightly increased seat height using a seat pad or lowering the shoes on the foot stretcher, you can then get a greater differential between the top of the seat and the heel, the bottom of the heel of the shoes. So that makes it easier to make the rocking forwards movement. Now, these are all finesses that you can experiment with yourself. You can try them out on a rowing machine indoors where it's very easy to adjust the feet up and down. Get a mirror, get a friend just to take a photograph of you, get a child to take a photograph of you. So take a picture of mummy now and take another one now. You can see afterwards what position you can achieve, whether you can get your shins vertical at the catch, whether or not you can achieve a forward rock position at the end of the stroke as you come onto the recovery. And then you can make these small adjustments for yourself. And over time, you come to know what is suitable for you. So that's just a quick run through of everything that you can do in your club boats to have a comfortable outing.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. We don't have any questions in the chat as of now, so I think we can move ahead to Mike Davenport's presentation.
Hi, everyone. It's Mike from Max Rigging. Thanks for being here. Let me congratulate you on taking time, investing in becoming better at rowing, becoming better with rowing equipment. And also let me congratulate you on being involved in rowing. It is, after all, where all the cool kids hang out. And thank you, Rebecca and Marlene, for having me on board. So what I'd like to do is give you a quick introduction. As I said, I'm Mike Davenport. I've been involved in rowing for about 50 years, and I've done, over the last 30 years, written a lot, presented a lot about rowing equipment, how to help people become more comfortable with it, how they can have it work better for them. They can maximize the equipment, if you will. I've done hundreds of workshops around the States and have several books out, one being Nuts and Bolts Guide to Rigging. And in that time that I've been working with rowing and coaches and athletes across the whole age spectrum, being involved with the national team and traveling around the world with the sport, I've seen three things that tend to pop up with master rowers. Roadblocks, if you will. What I'd like to do is take a few minutes to talk about those three things, how they may apply to you, and what you can do to reduce those roadblocks, maybe even find ways to help other people reduce them and take your rowing and your rowing equipment to the next level. The first roadblock is that many rowers, master rowers, come to rowing later in life. And because of that, they're involved in clubs, organizations. They don't have their own equipment, so they share equipment within that club or within that organization. So we have many rowers using few pieces of equipment. And a major roadblock there is sanitation. It's especially relevant now, especially these times, but it's always been really important, sanitation. And I'd like to be clear, there's two distinct differences between sanitation and cleaning. Cleaning equipment is removing dirt, grease, whatever, to improve performance and also to increase the life of the equipment. We, for example, at my rowing program, we would clean the equipment thoroughly once a week. We would wash everything with soap and water, scrub our oar handles, use, in my case, we would use Windex and green scrubbies on the oar handles and such. But that was all cleaning. And that is distinctly different than sanitation. Sanitation is where we are trying to make the equipment healthy to use and trying to remove any pathogens that could be transferred from one person to another. I've written a lot about it, especially my last book, Water Ready, that just came out. Also written about it on my blog, Max Rigging. Many people have written about it. I would say this, that your organization, your club, your group, however you want to classify it, should have a very rigorous, no pun intended, but a very rigorous sanitation program. When a rower uses a piece of equipment, that rower should know the equipment has been sanitized from the previous person that used it. If your program doesn't have an aggressive sanitation program, then it needs to, and you or someone else needs to be proactive in that. It depends on the program and where you are located, exactly what your sanitation should be. I'll give you an example. Our program, before a rower would touch an oar, that oar had been sanitized with bleach and water at the prescribed ratio from the manufacturer. It depends a little bit on the manufacturer. It's usually 10-to-1 ratio with freshly mixed bleach. But they had been sanitized, and the boat had been sanitized also. Indoor rowers, the handles had been sanitized. Unfortunately, there's my helpful kitty friend here. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening even now in all programs, and it should be across the board. So I would say, please check with your program and make sure you're up to standards. There's a couple of different ways that you can find the standards. The equipment manufacturers, Concept 2, Kroger, whoever is making your equipment, they are a good source of information. Probably one of the best sources of information, not only on cleaning, but also sanitation. But also you can get basic information from the web in many different areas that will go to specifically what you should do. And also in some cases, what you should not do. I'll give you a prime example of what you should not do. You should not have, and make sure this doesn't happen, you should not have bleach and ammonia in close proximity. If those two were to be mixed, it could be a very hazardous, almost a deadly combination of the gas that's produced. So those are just a few tips there in terms of sanitation. I see that happening with shared equipment. The second thing I see happen, it's a roadblock, and personally I find it not only annoying, but I feel for the people that it's happening to, is when they're rowing shared equipment, it's not adjusted properly for them. And I'm not just talking about small tweaks in the adjustment, say for speed. What I'm talking about are major adjustments that happen for comfort and can impact safety and health. So let me give you an example. Let me touch my screen here for a sec. So let me give you an example. Can you imagine getting into your car and someone had borrowed it and they have moved the seat to, say, the total opposite range where you like your seat. If you like your seat low, it's now up high. If you like it front towards the steering wheel, it's not all the way now towards the back. Mirrors are totally twisted around. When you sit in your seat, you look in the mirrors and you see your forehead. You don't see the road. You see the sky instead of the lane next to you. The radio is blaring music that you absolutely hate, and you like to drive with no music on. The wipers are set to full tilt, and the defroster is set. Hold on a second, I get my friendly cat here. All right, big guy, there you go. Yep, my teenage cat. The defroster is set so it doesn't come on, and yet it's a frosty day, so you can barely, if at all, see out the windshield. A little extreme, but that example gives you kind of a talking point or focal point in terms of rowing. And I see people row with equipment that's very similar to that. For example, I'll see tall people row with the feet all the way back, so they can hardly get their legs down fully, and they're tearing up the back of the legs on the back stops or the front stops, however you call those, but the stops on the tracks that are closest to the stern of the boat. The rigger is adjusted so that when they pull in with the oar handle, it's pulling in not up to, say, the ribs where they're comfortable pulling in, effective pulling, but down into their lap or up into their nose. Those may seem like exaggerations, but they're not. I see that happening. And it really takes away from not only the enjoyment level that rowers get or can get from the sport, but also from performance. And it can really increase the risk of injury. Most injuries in our sport, the great number of injuries, that percentage of injuries that we would have, come from overuse, and especially from overuse when the equipment isn't adjusted properly. So that's the second roadblock I see is people rowing, masters rowing with equipment that's not adjusted properly. The third roadblock is master rowers not knowing both sweep and sculling. There's no variation there in terms of these roadblocks between the two. Masters rowers not knowing how to and where to adjust the equipment. Now, I know our other speakers will go into more depth about that, which I think is great. But it's critical at least to have an understanding that rowing equipment can be adjusted. Even recreational rowing, even basic recreational rowing has some adjustments to it. Say foot stretchers, rigger height. As the equipment becomes more competitive, there are more adjustments and more fine tuning. But I see those not happening, and I see so many people not knowing that things should be adjusted. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to change the format a little bit, is that I'm going to show you some slides and talk over those slides through the magic of Rebecca and her computer skills. She's going to make that happen. I'll chime back in at the end. And if you do have questions, please let Marlene or Rebecca know. And anytime you have a question, feel free to reach out to me. I do get those all the time, and I really enjoy helping people as much as I can with their questions. So off to some slides, and let's see what we can learn about some of the basics that apply to masters rowers.
There we go. And I will now, as the magic, switch to the slides.
So next I wanted to talk to you about how engaged people are in your program and possibly yourself with your rigging. And if you see here from this simple little graph, we've got two extremes. On the very right is what I call rental car rigging. Rental car rigging are those people who, for example, when they rent a car, they just return the car, they drop the keys, maybe in the drop box or on the counter.
Rebecca, can you share your screen?
Out of the building, not giving that car they just returned another thought. So that's rental car rigging.
There you go. Thank you.
I see many people involved in the world of rowing who have that attitude about rigging. They go out to a practice, they row their boat, they come in, put it in the rack, and that's it. Never give it another thought till the next time they go out and row. On the other end of the extreme is what I call obsessive compulsive rigging disorder. Now, to be honest, we all know that person who has obsessive compulsive rigging disorder. That's the person that will wake up at 2:15 at night, overly concerned about the pitch on the forerigger, whether it's 1/4 of a degree too much or too little, or will obsess with foot stretcher angle or all the small little intricacies that could happen. Not only will they obsess about it, but then they will try to talk to people about it and try to fix it and massage it, and it goes on and on and on. And full disclosure, very, very close to being one of those people, if not, especially when I was coaching collegiately, in all honesty, I was that person. So I can speak from from a lot of empathy and sympathy for you folks that possibly fall in that category, that there could be medication, there could be therapy, or your organization may very well need you as long as you're not calling somebody else up in the middle of the morning and trying to talk to them about that rigor that's off a quarter degree. But most people fall someplace in the middle. And I would say it's very helpful if you will know where you fall on this scale and then get an idea. So for example, if you're rowing in a set quad or an 8, get an idea of how other people, where they fall on the scale within your boat. And if, let's say, if it's a quad and 3 of you are rental car rigging people, then it may suit you very well to have one person who's an obsessive compulsive rigging disorder person, or some combination of that. The second thing is
sorry, this is the moment where I move to the next slide. Here we go.
this scale here, and this is the scale of what makes a boat go fast. And it's simple from the standpoint of these layers, but there's a lot of nuances in these layers. And I don't want to go too deep into each one, but I do want to address each one. And if you remember your basic math from high school, the height of a pyramid, in this case, we're talking about the pyramid of boat speed. The height of the pyramid has a direct relationship to the width of the base. So here you can see the very first layer of this pyramid is leadership. And that's extremely critical to not only the quality of equipment you'll end up rowing, but how well the equipment is taken care of and how well the equipment is adjusted. And what I mean by leadership is someone or a group of people who will take charge of taking care of the equipment. Some people I've seen some groups have accountability teams where I've seen someone just maybe jump into that role, or maybe it passes around who's going to be in charge of the equipment, but there does need to be some leadership. And if you are rowing by yourself, you have a single, maybe you're rowing on a nice pristine lake and you really don't interact with anybody else, then you have to take your own leadership and be ready to be in charge of your equipment. The second level of what makes a boat go fast after the leadership, and that leadership also, if I can backtrack 1 second, that leadership also goes to designing workouts and figuring out the plans. But I know that that's not really within the scope of our discussion today. But the second level, for the athletes, you need to have the athletes. If you're looking if you're looking from the perspective of boat speed, you have to have athletes. And there could be a variety of different athletes. It could be all rather homogeneous. They could all be the same size and the same rowing ability, but more likely than not, with master's programs, you have a wide range of athletes and their abilities and capabilities, and their desire and their mental framework. But it's good to just have an understanding that if you are chasing boat speed, that second layer there, the athletes, is very critical. As we go up to the next layer, you can see level. You can see training, and training is, we're talking about the physical training, we're talking about the mental training, recovery, we're talking about nutrition, we're talking about so many components that go into training. Again, that's not within the scope of this discussion, and there's plenty of resources out there. And I know Rebecca and Marlene talk about this, but training is that kind of middle road in terms of making a boat go fast. The technique is fourth. The technique, the rowing technique, is what allows you to take the power you're generating and put it into the oar effectively so that you can you can power the boat. Technique also, proper technique will not only help you be effective, but help you reduce injuries, help increase your longevity, and also a proper technique will help you blend in with the people you're rowing with if you're rowing in team boats. So technique is really critical, but as you can see here, it's not as important as the training, and it's not as important as the capability of the athletes, which is not as important as the leadership. Now, the very tip of the pyramid, the two parts at the top here, that's very specific to our discussion today. And the two tops being equipment, two top levels being equipment, and then rigging. So often I see rowers, especially masters rowers, having this pyramid, these levels mixed up. And I'll give you an example. So you can see that the equipment is important, but it's not as important as the technique and training and athletes and leadership. So back in the early 1960s, a team from Russia came over to row in Philly. They were rowing at one of the larger races during the summer. It may have been Independence Day. I'm not sure of the exact race. But the U.S. coach for Vesper at the time, my friend, the late Alan Rosenberg, told me that when the Russians came over, they didn't bring a boat, but they were going to borrow a boat. And being good guests, Alan and the directors at Vesper opened up the boathouse to them, and they said graciously, you can pick whatever boat, they're racing an 8, whatever boat you would like to race, and that's your boat. Well, Alan said the Russian coach looked around and he pointed at the very top, and at the very top was a older wooden boat, quite heavy, hadn't been rowed in years. The Russian coach asked for it to be brought down. It was brought down, and he went through it, and he looked at it, and he said, yeah, we're going to row this boat. And Alan and the coaches were, are you sure? There's all these other newer, beautiful boats you could row. That's the boat you want? And the Russians said, yes, that's what we want. And of course, as you can probably guess, the reason I'm telling you the story is that then they went out, the Russians, then they went out, and not only did they row that boat very successfully, but they beat the U.S. team that ended up being the U.S. national team that ended up, or the national 8 that ended up going on and winning the Olympics in a boat that was probably 10 or 15 years older than any other boat in the boathouse. So the point of that story is that, yes, equipment is important, but I see so many masters rowers be distracted by not only the quality of the equipment, but the age of the equipment. And sometimes it can really get in the way of not only performance, but also enjoyment of the sport of rowing. Now, this isn't to say there's anything wrong with having a nice new boat and brand new oars and the latest electronics and such. But what I am saying is that I don't believe that there's a relationship between the newness of equipment and boat speed, the color of the equipment and boat speed. You can kind of fill in the rest there. Well, the very tip of the pyramid dawn, if you will, is you can see there it says rigging. So rigging is that key component there. If you want to squeeze that last bit of boat speed out, then rigging is the place that you can get speed, you can get performance. But again, it's not as critical as the other 5 levels now, or layers. And I'm not talking about rigging from the standpoint of, let's say, a rigger being put upside down. I'm talking about a rigger being maybe adjusted within an acceptable range, maybe height being between, I'll go with inches here, between 7 inches and 6.75 inches. Where does the exact adjustment fit in there? So you'll see quite a variety of things there. And I remember a story, this was several years ago, a friend of mine who was coaching a competitive team. We competed against each other each year. He was always put out a great team. And he called me up and said, "Hey, Mike, I need your opinion. Just got a donation for $30,000. And I'm just trying to figure out what boat I should buy. Like, what boat will help me get to the next level?" And I knew his program really well, and I knew the type of equipment he had, and he had good equipment. And I said, "In all honesty, Coach," and we had a good relationship. I said, "In all honesty, Coach, you know what I would do is I would take that $30,000, I would invest it in getting an assistant coach, someone who knows training programs, is really good at teaching technique, and could help you with recruiting." He hung up the phone without saying anything, hung up the phone, and pretty much didn't talk to me for 6 months. Then we did meet up a year later at a conference, and over a soft drink, he said, "You're right. We bought a new boat. It really didn't help, but an assistant coach not only would have made the team better, would have made my life better." So those 6 levels there, or 6 layers of the pyramid, are what contribute to boat speed. And if you're not interested in speed, if you're just interested in going out and rowing and having an enjoyable paddle and seeing sunrises or sunsets and wildlife and stuff, that's absolutely great. This pyramid will also apply to that. And the last one I wanted to talk to you about, and these are all slides that I use within my clinics that I teach around the country, is just a simple little matrix of information and skills. You fall somewhere on this scale in terms of equipment and in terms of rigging. You could be in the upper right hand corner where you have high skills and high information, which are a lot of information. Or you could fall in the bottom left hand quadrant of low skills. I don't know anything about rigging, and I don't know how to do it or make adjustments. All of those quadrants are okay to be in. The reason I wanted to bring that up is because it's critical to know where you are on this quadrant. And then it's critical to know where, if you're running in a program or a group, where someone who's in charge of the equipment is on this scale, this graph. Because if you have someone who's in charge of the equipment and maybe they are super excited and energetic, and they have, say, they're mechanically oriented and love working with their hands, but they don't know much about either rowing or rigging, and we see this quite a bit. We have wonderful parents that volunteer, but they're mechanically capable, both women and men, but they don't know anything about rowing. They never rowed. They're doing it because they're volunteering, because their children row. Get them information. a little self-promotion here. You could have them read Nuts and Bolts Guide to Rigging, or I have online courses. Go to YouTube. There's some great courses up there. There's some great videos up there. Howard Croker has some really nice, simple, engaging videos about basic rigging, and they're all free. There's so much information out there now that you can have people just go out and get that information. So that's it in a nutshell. Some very key things about roadblocks that get in the way of masters and their rowing equipment, and then also three simple things that you can process where you are. Are you on the scale of rental car rigging or obsessive compulsive rigging? How do you or your program fit on this pyramid of boat speed? Are you interested in boat speed? Is it more just recreational enjoyment rowing, which is fantastic, but that pyramid could also apply to that. And then finally, whoever's in charge of the equipment, and there should be somebody in charge of the equipment, whoever's in charge of the equipment, where do they fall on this scale? So feel free to reach out to me anytime, mike@maxrigging.com. There's tons of free information up on my site. I have a YouTube channel, and I also have several books up on Amazon, and you can also get the books just about in any, or you can get at least Nuts and Bolts about in any bookstore around the world. And I wish you all the best, and go fast.
I do love the fact that he wraps up with "go fast," having made it very clear that the color of the boat has got nothing to do with how fast the boat will go. Now we've got a couple of questions. First one here, any thoughts on seat pads? And if yes, how thick? Marlene, do you want to answer that one?
Well, I think it's going to depend on our discussion when Mike talks about rigging adjustments. And I would say the thickness of your seat pad is probably going to depend on what you need to do and whether you want to use a seat pad at all versus changing the height of the top of your seat. So I think we should wait until we hear from Mike Purser.
I have one from my little piece about getting to the correct finish position with your oar handles at the correct height. Choose the seat pad that allows you to get to the correct height. That's one. And I've got another one from Ruth Berenson, who says, is there any difference in rigging for boat speed and rigging for pleasure? Marlene, have you got any views on this?
Well, hopefully they go together, I would say, because I know Ruth Berenson likes to go fast, but well, obviously rowing for pleasure, we have to look at comfort, and is the athlete comfortable, and are they, you know, the basic adjustments you were talking about, sharing equipment in terms of foot stretcher adjustment, height adjustment. Hopefully being comfortable will improve your boat speed. I think even in a very well-rigged boat, if the athlete is not comfortable, they're not going to maximize their boat speed. So I think those things have to go together. But certainly if you want to optimize your speed, which our guests are also going to talk about from a performance point of view, you have to be comfortable and attend to really specific details and testing and trials of different adjustments to see what makes your boat go fastest.
Thank you. Now, we had a question from earlier. Stephen Hall asked, I'd like to know the measurements from the oar lock to the back wheel that you mentioned earlier. What's the range? So this was for sweep, and the measurement is from the face of the gate to the back wheel, and the range is 58 to 62 centimeters. So for my women's 8 and I'm 5'10", we adjusted to 60 centimeters. If you're a lot smaller, you'd want something shorter. And of course, it isn't just about that one measurement. As you now know, it's also about the span, the length of the oars.
There was one question just before we move on and have Mike Purser give us his presentation. Question, back wheel, are you measuring the axle of the sternmost wheel or to the stern edge of the stern wheel on the seat for your through pin measurement? And
So yeah, I can answer that.
okay.
Generally, we find it easier to measure to the bit of the wheel that's closest to the bow, because you can put your finger down and feel it. When you're actually sitting on the seat, there's often not enough room to look around your butt and to look under the seat and actually see where the axle is. So yes, if you have someone on the bank who can go look for you, that's great. But if the athlete needs to check for themselves, we found it easier just to feel your finger where the back wheel is when your legs are straight. And then you can roll your seat forwards and move it away, and then you can turn around and see what it is. So Tom Woodman, I hope that's clear.
Good. Well, thank you. And we do in the chat, we've started, there's a little competition going. What's your combined age of yourself and your single skull? So we're up to 88 so far. So,
This is a new measure for me.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to introduce Mike Purser. It's a pleasure to have him here. Mike hails to us from Ontario, and Mike is a leader in rigging analysis, and his book Rigging has been updated and has been used by coaches for over 30 years. Mike has a terrific video software that he uses to do rigging analysis and help individuals set up their boats, their singles and their crews to really try to maximize performance. And he has presented in topics such as rigging, rowing technique, selection for national team crews, and training. So I would like to welcome Mike Purser.
Thank you, Marlene. I'm going to share my screen so we can start this, and I will probably be on Coach Davenport's scale, the obsessive compulsive. Marlene, can you see that?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay. So rigging for masters, I want to talk about the considerations for rigging and matching athletes with their rigging. Oh, okay. First button doesn't work. Well, the goal, let's just review this. The goal in rigging, the goal is to adjust the rigging to provide each athlete a comfortable and biomechanically effective stroke position, length, and load to maximize the average boat speed for the crew's ideal stroke rate and ratio. And there's 3 points here that I'd like to highlight. First being comfort, and Rebecca already talked about that. The second one is the length and load, and that's what we're going to focus on today, the length and load of the rigging. But what we're trying to do is to allow the crew to row with their ideal stroke rate and stroke ratio. So those are the overall parts we're going for. And when we look at the athlete considerations, we're going to talk about the individual athlete stroke length, their reach, their power capacity, how much pulling force they have, and their individual body weight. And then we're going to contrast that or link that to the dimensions of spread or span, outboard, inboard, or combined, they would be the oar length. I'm going to show you some rigging charts that I'm working on that are based on length, power, and weight. And lastly, I'll just go through an exercise on how to adjust rigging to change the individual drive time. And I'll talk about a lot about drive time. This comes back to the stroke rate and the ratio that you're rowing. So what is the ideal drive time that you have? And this can be controlled by the length and load, and will allow you to row at the rate and ratio that you find most effective. So first of all is the athlete stroke length, how far you reach at the catch and where you finish in the finish position. This is related to your height, your reach, your flexibility, and is related to the outboard stroke length, which we'll just talk about now. In my rigging book, I talk about work distance, the distance the athlete is working, pulling from the catch position to the finish position. What is that length and how it relates to the stroke length? So here's a little a couple triangles, congruent triangles that sort of show that the athlete stroke length is somewhat proportional to the outboard of the outboard stroke length as it relates to the inboard and outboard of the oar. Rowing technique, although rowing technique has a big influence on your catch and finish and how much effective stroke length you actually have. But in general, the longer the athlete stroke length, the longer the drive time. We come back there to drive time. The second athlete factor that we're going to talk about is power. How much power do you have? How much force can you apply during the stroke? And the stronger athletes can apply greater power and a greater force. And the greater power will decrease the time in the water, which is the drive time. I hope I'm not going through this too fast. The last aspect of the individual athlete I want to talk about is the body weight. And the greater body weight is greater hull displacement in the water and greater resistance on the boat. And the greater mass has greater inertia. And this is what we're looking at now. Of course, force is mass times acceleration. And in Dr. Klebsnov's book, he talks about the force of the system equals the mass of the system times acceleration of the system. And if you're good in algebra, you can say the acceleration then is equal to the force divided by the mass. And what we come up with then is lighter weight athletes with a lower mass will have greater acceleration when applying the same force. I ran across this. This is one of my rigging analysis sheets. And in 2019, I started working with Fluid Design, doing custom rigging for people getting new singles. And I would get a lot of information from each of the individuals, and I would set up a rigging as part one of the custom rigging process, and then part two was to get a video of them rowing, and then do what I do is video rigging analysis. And from the video, I can measure drive time, blade slip, effective stroke length, stroke position, stroke rate, and stroke ratio. And after doing a number of athletes, rigging a number of athletes and getting feedback from a number of athletes, I found that the lighter weight athletes had very low drive times. And the very low drive time would be down about 0.7 seconds, where typically we see drive times in singles from 0.76 to 0.86 or somewhere around 0.8 seconds. And there's always outliers, but generally drive times in singles are around 0.8. And I followed up on that, looking at why are the lightweight athletes have these low drive times, and concluded that it was their body weight and the reduced resistance on the boat and the reduced mass that allowed them to accelerate much faster. And by doing that, they would have lower drive times. And so I changed my formula so that now when I'm custom rigging boats, I take into account the athlete's weight, and I'm starting to get better numbers based on the drive time that allows the stroke rate and effective stroke length. So this all comes back to drive time. And remember, that's what we're after is what rate and ratio are you targeting from your training, from your preparation for a race. So now let's get right into the dimensions of rigging then that control drive time. And that is the span, the spread in sweep, the outboard or the inboard. And let's address the athlete's stroke length, power, and body weight, and how they relate to these measurements. And these measurements are all related in the length and load considerations when rigging. But the final slide, we will address which way we go with that. We all know what spread is. The spread is the distance from the center line of the boat to the center line of the oarlock pin. Or in sculling, we say span from the center line of the pin to the center line of the pin. How they relate to the athlete's ability then, or drive time, is just this. The spread or span affect the outboard stroke length. A greater spread is a shorter stroke length. As we push the spread out, we shorten the stroke length. And this, of course, would reduce the drive time. How it relates to load, the span relates to load. As you're pushing on your foot stops, you're also pushing on your oarlock against the oar. Again, greater spans or spreads have lower drive times. I put this slide in, but it's I think it's pretty unneeded. Here we can look at the oars as a lever, which it acts as it is a lever. It's a simple lever, a first class lever, second class lever, third class lever. In any event, I think we're all familiar with that. Let's just look at reducing the outboard. We move the button closer to the blade. If we reduce the outboard, we reduce the load. If we went back to our slides and thought about the oar as a lever, as we move the fulcrum closer to the load is reduced, easier to pull through the water. The length, inboard, outboard, as it relates to length, if we said these are similar triangles, then the outboard divided by the inboard, outboard divided by the inboard, is the same as the stroke length divided by the work distance. These are proportional. Bottom line is that if we reduce the outboard, we will reduce the length. And if we reduce the length, we also reduce the drive time. I'm pushing through this pretty fast, but these are charts that I'm developing for my updated rigging book that address power, body weight, and stroke length. And these are charts for masters women, singles. These are charts for masters men. And let's just take a look at these then. So an athlete, and this might be me at 504 for a 1K. This is the power I have. My stroke length, if I measured it on an erg, is not 110. But if I was a very petite athlete, then it may be 110 centimeters from the reach from where my oar handle is at the catch to where it is at the finish. So this whole group here is for people with a erg score of 504 and 110 centimeter stroke length. Now, the last part that's important to consider is your weight. And if you were 51 kilograms, your span might be in a range of 158, your oar length 285, and your inboard 85.5. If you were on the other end of the spectrum and you had a lot of mass to move with the same 100 watts, and you're only moving at 110 centimeters, your rigging should be lighter, because what we're after here again is the drive time. We want the drive time that allows us to row at the rate we want to row with the rhythm that we want to row it. And so at 80 kilograms, your span would be greater, reducing the length and load. Your oars will be shorter, and the inboard might be the same. But the outboard and the span would definitely provide a lighter load, and that all comes back to we're moving more weight through the stroke, and this is important consideration. If we look at the other end of the spectrum, and we say you have an erg score around 337 for 1K. You're about 275 watts each stroke. And so if you are an 80 kilogram athlete, your span might be, now this is 140 centimeters, your stroke length. So you're moving a lot further with the oar. But your stroke length might be 150, or your span might be 159, almost 160. Oars at 285, and the inboard at 87.5. So let's just do one last one. How about if we contrast that with the athlete that pulls 140 centimeter of stroke length with the athlete that rows 110 centimeters of stroke length. So instead of the 159.8, our span might be much tighter, because we're still pulling 275 watts, but we're pulling it over a much shorter distance. But the outboard, so by decreasing the span, we increase the outboard stroke length, and we have a longer oar and a shorter inboard. And this sort of contrasts or brings together the power, the stroke length, and the body weight. And these three things have influence over the span, the outboard, and the inboard.
Mike, may I interrupt briefly? We've got a question. How do you measure your stroke length? I think most people know how to measure the other things.
Well, I measure effective stroke length with video, and my effective stroke length is basically how far the boat moves in the water between the time the oar is fully buried to when the oar comes out of the water. And with my software, I can use the boat length as a reference, and if I know how long the boat is. If your boat is 7.92 meters, and I can stop the video when the blade goes in the water, and stop the video when the blade comes out of the water, and then measure how far the boat has moved. And so that's how I do to measure the effective stroke length. So final slide. And this is practical application. Let's just do this and go through it. So drive time being my goal. I want to row just over 0.8 of a second in the water. And I know that if I'm rowing 32 strokes a minute, that's going to be my goal. and it's going to give me the rhythm that I feel that is where I race the best. So my target then is going to be between 76 and 86 100ths of a second. But when I measure myself, when I measure my drive time, it's at 0.68 seconds. It's way below. I'm getting the blade through the water way too fast. And which meaning that either my rate's going to go up or I'm going to have an extremely long recovery time. So the drive time is too low. It's more than 0.06 seconds below my typical drive time. And this is how I analyze crews that when I'm doing custom rigging analysis. So I look at the athlete and I look at the athlete and say, is the athlete a tall, long stroke? Is the athlete a tall, long with a long stroke? And if he is, or she is, then I increase the outboard by 1 centimeter. And I do it again if needed. Conversely, if I have a very strong athlete with a shorter stroke, then I decrease the span. Both solutions are related to the athlete and what kind of athlete it is. This athlete will have a very long stroke already. So I don't need to give him any more stroke arc. I can just increase the outboard to get more drive time. Conversely, this short athlete doesn't have a very long stroke. So I'm going to decrease the span to give this athlete a greater stroke arc and also a greater stroke length. And it is also going to increase the greater stroke length will increase the drive time. Alternatively, if I have an athlete and I measure the drive time and the athlete is 0.898 seconds in the water, the drive time is way too high. It really looks like this athlete is struggling to get the rate, and to get the rate, they really have to rush the slide. So again, look at the athlete. Is this a tall, long athlete? And if so, I increase the span, reducing the arc. He's already a really, really long athlete. He probably has a really big stroke arc. So by reducing the span, I can reduce the time in the water and also reduce the stroke arc, which may be too great already. And if I have the athlete that is has a very short stroke, but very strong, then I would decrease the outboard. I have a short athlete. He's got a short stroke arc angle, and I don't want to reduce the stroke arc angle. I just want to reduce the time in the water. So I would decrease the outboard, and by doing that, it would decrease the length, and with lower length, I would have a shorter drive time. There you go. I think I went through that pretty quick, but I'm hoping people can.
You did, Mike.
People can
Excellent.
see it again by joining on the website, and happy to answer questions.
Brilliant. Well, I'm lining them up for you, Mike, so I hope you're ready. So the first and simple one is, what effect do changes in span and spread have on the catch and the finish angle? From Deb.
The change in the spread or span. Well, I don't have a slide for that right now. But if you increase, I do. Here, if you increase the span or spread, as you can see here in this slide, this is from my first book actually. It decreases. Increase in the span will decrease the stroke arc. So you have less catch angle and maybe less finish angle. You could have less catch angle and less finish angle.
Great, very straightforward. A question now from Schuster. Can the Empower Orlock be used to guide rigging?
Yes. Yes, it can. It's a very useful tool. It will also measure your drive time as well as the angles, and give you really good feedback on your catch slip and your finish wash. That's an excellent tool.
Fantastic. Eric is asking, is the distance per stroke from an NK GPS an accurate guide for drive length?
I don't think so. I've never used an NK distance to measure effective drive length. No.
I agree. I think, Eric, you'll find that distance per stroke is measuring something completely different. It's measuring how far your boat has moved that stroke. It's not got to do with your drive length. Carol asked formally, how do you measure stroke length? And you've already answered that. Then Hilary Parkhurst has said, how do we know what's ideal for us as we have different strengths?
Yeah, excellent. This is exactly my point. If it feels light, if you're in a boat and it feels light, and you had someone able to video you and you could measure it, but if it feels light, then you want to increase your drive time. It's through the water too fast. And if it feels really heavy and you struggle getting to a certain rate, or you struggle getting your oars through, then it's probably rigged too heavy, what we would say too heavy, and that would be reducing the outboard or increasing the span.
Got it. And a follow-up question about the Empower Orlock. Which Empower data piece is equivalent or used to measure drive time?
I would think, now you'd have to, the way I measure drive time is a little bit different than what's available on the Empower Orlock, but it might be from the catch, the time between the catch lock on after the blade slip to the finish position past the wash. I measure drive time from when the blade is buried, fully buried, to when it's released and feathered and you're sitting in the finish position.
Great. A Row Perfect user says there's stroke length is part of the output. Is this a approximation for stroke length for your rigging measurements?
You know, it is, Rebecca. I find though, because when I do custom rigging, I asked athletes to send a video of themselves on an erg for 5 or 6 strokes at the whatever rate they intend to row or race. And I find that on an erg, they often overreach and they're providing the measurements that are their shins go forward and their slides are very close to their heels. And I'm able, using the video, I'm able to readjust their submission. If they say my stroke length is 1.45 meters, and then I watch the video and I stop the video in the catch position that they would be at in a boat where their shins are perpendicular and they're not overreaching. So yeah, I hope I answered that for you.
No, you did. That's a good one. Now we have a good question from Karen Fecto, who says, what if there's a mixed double with a light short female and a tall male?
So it all comes down, custom rigging and individual rigging all comes down to going in together at the catch, coming out together at the finish. And so they have the same drive time. going in, coming out together. And the last part of that question might be to position the strokes so that they're similar. So they're going past the perpendicular, the big peak force point is very close in the stroke.
Right. There are a couple of questions which are very individual. I'd just like to say to everyone who's listening and people who've emailed them in, we're not going to answer really, really individual questions, but there is a very nice one here about a men's four, where this gentleman, Matt, says he is the shortest crew member. Can you adjust the rig? Should you adjust the rig? Is it wise to adjust the rig to the individual, or should the crew all be rigged the same?
That would be how competitive are we? And how much to the obsessive compulsive side of the rigging are we on? Again, custom rigging is all about going in together and getting out together. And if there's a very short athlete, then in a four, then what could you do? You could reduce the span to give them a bigger stroke arc and increase their time in the water so they do go in together and come out together.
It also depends, I think, if you're sharing that boat with someone else. Most clubs wouldn't let you do an individual rig for a boat if it isn't always the same athlete in that seat.
Right.
If it's privately owned boat, fill your boots, make it as individual as you like. Now, Carlos Retegui is asking, would you adjust your gearing for a head race 5K? Would you change your rig?
Well, and I go back to what is our goal? Our goal is to allow the athlete to row at that ideal stroke rate and rhythm that they can maximize their average boat speed. And so, do they row at a higher rate? Do they row the head race or the 5K race at a lower, much lower rate? And if they do row it at a much lower rate, the drive time won't change that much, but they'll have a lot of time on the recovery, which is not effective for accelerating the boat.
We've got a couple of slightly more technical questions about the boat setup.
Ask Volker those then.
No. I think you're going to enjoy this. How is the starboard oarlock differential built into a rigger, says Jess?
I find that some of the boat manufacturers, the actual mainstay or the rigger is angled at differently, so that at the oarlock it's a centimeter higher on the starboard side.
Yeah.
Not all boat builders, but some boat builders.
And our last question from Clytie Rimberg. I got a new boat and I've had to move the stern mounted rigger all the way to the stern in order to have room at the release. So my feet are all the way to the bow. Is this a problem?
He'd have to check the trim on the boat and really look at the trim at the finished position or the catch position. The rigger adjustment is provided to allow adjustments with trim. Now, if he's got his feet all the way to the bow, it's not a problem unless the bow is really going deep in the water at the finish. And if it is, then he needs a bigger boat.
Yeah. So trim is the fore to aft pitch through the stroke as to how the boat is moving. So particularly if someone's underboated, you might see the water level almost cover the stern during the power phase if they're if the boat is too small for them. Is that correct?
Yes, as you go into full reach in the catch position, the stern will be very low. And at the finish position, the bow will be lower, and it shouldn't be lower than the stern, but it will be much lower than. And so the change in angle of the freeboard throughout the stroke is sort of the trim, the change in trim. And if we measure trim, it's the angle between the freeboard, a line along the deck or the edge of the deck, and the water surface.
Great. Mike, thank you. That was not only erudite and extremely informative. There's going to be an awful lot of homework, I think, for most of us listening as we go review your charts after having frantically rowed a 1K piece. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome. Happy to be here.
Now, Volker Nolte is our third speaker today, and Volker is not only a former international athlete, he rowed for Germany. He also was one of the first people who tested and trialed the sliding rigger single, which is a story for another day. He's the recently retired professor of kinesiology from the Western University in Ontario and has been coaching their crew for many years. But in his retirement, obviously having time for other things, he's written a book called Masters Rowing. The link to the book is in the lessons that go alongside this webinar. Prior to that, he edited and co-authored 2 books, both called Rowing Faster, volumes 1 and 2. And right now he's going to be talking to us about rigging and oars. Volker.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca and Marlene, for having me, and hi to everyone. I will try to get you more confused than my 2 pre-speakers did already. And I would like to maybe set in advance, I believe in general, rowers, specifically the people that we have here who are all interested in the topics, they know already quite a bit about technique and rigging. And in rigging, this individual rigging or changing things, it's a very logical thing. So the main thing that I would like to pass on is give some general concepts for you to understand that you will make your decisions properly, logically, to set up a boat. It is absolutely impossible, even in the 2 hours that we spent here today, to answer all the questions to the detail and give really final recommendations for every single one with every different equipment. So I would like to add a few parts here, and I will share my screen now here for this one. So I assume that everyone can see this, right? Yes. And the first thing is I would like to maybe remind everyone what is actually rigging doing for boat speed. And I will make a little comparison here. We have here a motor. This is actually from my car that I drive currently, right? This motor has a certain power, that what Mike was speaking about, that you can test on your on ergometer and such things. And then you have a gear shift where you can choose a certain gear for different circumstances, and this gives you speed. And for example, if you start to drive, you have no velocity, you have to accelerate your car, you would obviously start with the first gear. So you have a translation of the power to a very small change in speed of the wheels, but very, very powerful, right? Where if you drive already at a certain velocity, you actually want to use a higher gear where the power is then transferred to a translation system that carries actually a large velocity, but is not as powerful. So when you use this, obviously at a lower speed, your change in speed, acceleration is much higher, where in a higher speed, with the same motor, the same power, obviously through the gearing, the acceleration is a little bit less. The same thing happens in rowing. You have the motor, which is you, the rower, right? And then you change the rigging, which we are talking about. And with this, you change the speed. And with the same power you have, depending on the rig, you actually get different velocities. And so we have to find a rig that fits your power to reach a certain speed at a certain level. And it's different if you row a 100-meter race or a 10-kilometer race, or if you want to do a long distance training versus a race situation. However, if you then look into our boat houses, whenever you look around, you find this very interesting measurement, 288, 88, 160. And I would say almost to 80% of all the time, this is the measurement you find in sculling. And these measurements are actually used by very strong people like Mahi Drysdale, right? And then you look at this and you find the same rig for a lightweight woman in a recreational situation, and she uses the same rig, and this cannot be, because obviously the power of the engine of a Mahi Drysdale is certainly different than literally any one of us in the boat. So we have to find a more individual rigging for our rowing. So here I would like to take one of these questions that I actually got beforehand from Rebecca. It says here, total length of oars, inboard, outboard measurements. What should the total oar length be, and what determines that? I hear these questions very, very frequently. People ask me, what kind of oar length and inboard and whatever should I choose? And this is actually a simple question, but it's not easy to answer, because they are influenced by a number of different parameters. So for example, are you highly competitive? It's completely different than if you are only competitive, you do regular training, or you're recreational. So if you ask someone about the proper oar length, inboard, and so on, you have to start at first is, where are you on this scale of highly competitive to recreational? Secondly is, for some people, it is actually important simply to stay afloat, right? Or get a solid feedback, or get the feel of easy gliding. So for example, if you are a recreational rower who likes to row for 3 hours from one place to another through a nice countryside, you want to have an easy gliding. You want to go easy over the whole time. And this makes a completely different requirement for the setting of the oars than for a highly competitive rower who'd want to do this over 1,000 meters. And then we spoke already about, is this club equipment or is this your own equipment, right? And then the next thing is which equipment you are using, which kind of boat. Are you using a brand new high performance shell, or are you using the newest thing, these ocean oars, boats, right? Bigger boats, heavier boats, right? Then which oars are you using? Which kind of blades you are using? And depending on all these factors, I would give you completely different answers. So therefore, we need to talk about, to understand what is needed, and then get some general ideas in which direction you should actually rig. So let's talk about a few things. The one would be shaft. And I use here, there are shafts out there with different diameters, right? We have the ultralights, or the Croker, it's M1, low I, M4, skinny arrow. So the ultralight is very, very light, but have the thicker shaft. The skinny is the newest one with a very small diameter. And then you have a stiffness differences, extra soft, soft, medium. So only with this one here, you have already 9 different possibilities to get a different shaft, and you need to know which one you have in order to maximize your rigging. The next thing is, which kind of blade design do you have? And now I'm not even closely complete with the number of blades that I have here. And I took in the pictures only concept 2 blades, but then I put some names from Croker as well as from Dreyer onto this, right? So Marcon ores are these old symmetrical ores, big plates, and it gets little big plates. This was the first asymmetrical plate that came out to where we still have this ridge there in the middle of the blade. Then we have the smoothie, the plane, and then we have the vortex edge. So we have a vortex edge, or we have the plane, right? And this is called slick with the croaker. We have the arrow plate, we have alpha apex with Dreyer plates. They all are similar, but there are small differences depending on the design. Then we have the new kind of plate coming out from Concept 2 is the comp plate. The similar plate we have from Dreyer, it's this ER plate, which is a shorter plate, but relatively wide. And then on the end of the spectrum, in terms of the overall size of the plate surface, is the fat plate. This plate has a relatively wide shape and long. So it's the highest, largest plate surface that we find. Concept 2 gives some ideas. If you want to choose a certain plate, if you have the choice doing this, you buy your own plate. You can see here, there, depending on the entry, the feel for the first third of the drive, last third of the drive, not the big plate feels softer at the entry, but a little bit heavier in the finish. So if you like to feel more heaviness in the finish, you want to go to this plate. On the other end, the fat plate is very sharp at the beginning, but it's a little bit lighter in the end. And you have all these different feelings. And again, now think about it. We have already 9 different shaft opportunities, and then we have 10 different plate shapes. We have already about 100 opportunities to have something different for you, right? So how do we select a shaft and a plate? I would recommend to think about the idea here, the different shaft stiffnesses, right? So now I cannot see this here on my screen, Sopla. I cannot read this over there because it's in my way. Certain advantages. Obviously, the medium plate has the highest advantage. The stiffer a plate is, the more of your power gets actually transferred into speed, right? The handling is the opposite, right? The extra soft plate is a little bit easier to handle, where a stiffer plate has more direct feedback, is not so forgiving. The cost, obviously, it may play a role for you. The extra soft is less material, it's cheaper, where the medium has more material, it's a little bit more expensive. So, or you have the different shaft types, low eye towards skinny, right? Again, the advantage is low eye is very, very light. Skinny has very little wind resistance. The ultralight is a good size there. It has a good advantage. For many years, people are rowing these and still rowing them, right? The cost, again, play a role. The skinny blade, because it's the diameter is so small, needs more material. It's most expensive. The least expensive is the ultralight. Handling, again, the low eye is probably most difficult because it's very, very light in terms of wind and effect and so on, right? And the handling of the skinny is obviously feels really nice and easy. So it's a very good handling, right? So then the plate shapes, and I took only 3 here, right? So the easiest to handle is the big plate, and the most difficult to handle is the fat plate, and the efficiency is exactly the opposite. The most efficient plate that there is on the market is the fat plate, simply because of the size of the plate shape, right? And the lowest efficiency is the old big plate. However, for example, if you are a beginner, right, if you want to use a certain plate for novices, right, it's maybe the handling is more important than the efficiency, right? Where if you are a high performance rower, you want to have probably a higher efficiency, and you're not worried so much about the handling because you can learn to do this. So again, with all these possibilities, and I can obviously answer a very specific question in terms of if you want something specific, then I can recommend that you use a certain stiffness, a certain shaft type, or a certain blade. But in general, the answer is very difficult to find. Now here to the different charts that I'm using, and I must say I use a little bit of different concept that Mike is using in his book, where he gives a much larger variety of numbers. It goes back, actually, it's a little story. I was working, before I came to Canada, I was working in a company, and if we had a meeting with our boss and we had to talk about a certain project, and we had to present some data or such, the boss would only take proposals that were on one page. So I tried to put everything in one page. This is a learned value, so to speak, that I tried always to do. But of course, this is not as precise or as accurate as other larger presentations are. The way to read this is, and this is now a chart out of my book that was mentioned here, that I wrote together with my friend Wolfgang. The book is Masters Rowing, and this is from this book, right? The idea would be, at first you have to think about which plate shape you have. On the one end, the fat plates, on the other hand, the slick and smoothie. I didn't take Marcon oars, and I didn't take big plates in there because it's getting really confusing. And these plates are very seldomly used. And again, you can logically do the math, so to speak, on your own by changing it over. So in the example that I would like to make here is, I will talk about the slick plate or smoothie, right? And we say we are looking for a single, right? And the first start that I would always propose is what I call the normal, or these gray shaded areas, that you go there first. You say, okay, the normal go-to, you start with 1.60 meters and a normal length of 285. Now, this is for all kinds of rowers, right? And you have now to go from here and individualize for your specific consideration, right? The inboard is, from my perspective, always connected with the span. There's this formula, right, that the half of the span plus 8 centimeters, this gives you the inboard. The reason being is you want to have a certain overlap in order to row for the longest time during the drive horizontally in the middle of the boat. This obviously could be 7 centimeter plus or 6 centimeter plus, but not 15 centimeters or 2 centimeters. So it gives you a good idea where you should start with. So if you are now less skilled and you want to adjust the measurement here, what you do is you want to get the span smaller, right, in order to get a larger reach, what Mike was talking about, get a little bit more time in the water, because normally if you are less skilled or not as flexible, you cannot reach this long. So what you do, you simply go here with this one to the side of making it longer. That this means the span smaller, which then again would also have an effect on the inboard, right? In this case, of course, you have to be careful, right? Because now you are actually increasing the overall load. You may have to move the length accordingly, right? So, or you want to go the other way, right? You want to make it lighter. You simply move the length of the oar over from whatever 285 to 281. Having talked about this, is I would actually recommend to be not so finicky with the numbers. So half a centimeter skull length, or half a centimeter span is from my perspective very, very hard to find a difference. And specifically, if you are rowing in different conditions, wind conditions, you half a centimeter one way or the other will not make a big difference. So if so, make changes in centimeter, 2 centimeter increments and really feel the difference and then go from there. So next would be, what does it mean when you change the inboard? Well, when you change the inboard, you're not only changing the inboard, you also change the span, of course. That's, for me, it's always a fact. Plus, if you change the inboard, automatically you change the outboard, right? So therefore, changing only one thing is always a little bit tricky and needs to be considered very, very carefully. So the next thing is, if changing the inboard, you also change the stroke length. And with the changing the stroke length, you make it the dynamic gearing, like Valery Kleshnev calls it, heavier. So if you only change the inboard and span, you make the stroke longer, it gets heavier, right? So then if you change the inboard, but you want to maintain the feeling of the load, then you have to accordingly change the outboard. And there is a rule of thumb. If you want to have the same kind of feeling, if you change the inboard by 1 centimeter, you have to change the outboard by 2 centimeters. This means you are going 1 centimeter shorter inboard, you have to go 2 centimeters shorter outboard. This means if you want to change the inboard and want to maintain the load, you have to change actually the overall oar length by 3 centimeters, right? Then another question is then the last thing here from my side is here, how can I pitch my oar and scull? This is a little bit a tricky one, and Rebecca encouraged me to talk a little bit about this in more detail. Number one is, if you want to talk about pitch on your oar, then you have to understand what factors actually affect the pitch on the blade. We will talk about this. And then we will have to talk about how to measure the pitch on the oar, right? And the equipment you use and the procedure you use. And then the last thing is how you actually adjust the pitch on the oar and which equipment you need to use and which procedure. So in order to understand what is overall the pitch on the blade, we have to understand which factors are going in. The first factor that goes in there is actually the pitch on the pin. So this is actually the one thing that I measure first, right? I take and this is whatever the blue rectangle there, this should identify the pin. And ideally, the pin should have 0 degrees, relative forward, backwards, and lateral outwards, right? So then you put the oar lock on top of the pin, and here you see with this a little bit thicker shaded, this should show the different pitch blocks, or according to the pitch block, you get actually a pitch on the oar lock. And this is built in the oar lock depending on these pitch blocks, right? So if you have neutral pitch blocks, which you see this when they call 4-4 pitch blocks, they are neutral because you can use them one way or the other. So you're turning around, of course. You have actually in the oar lock is an inbuilt pitch of 4 degrees. So only if you use these asymmetric pitch blocks, you get more or less than 4 degrees. And the pitch blocks, the old pitch blocks go from 1 to 7, and literally no one rows 1 or 7 degrees. So actually concept 2 change the pitch blocks so that you only can go, as far as I know, from 2 to 6 anymore, right? So you have an inbuilt pitch on the oar lock, and then you have a pitch on the oar itself, and this is measured from the sleeve, the flat part of the sleeve, to the flat part on the oar, and this should be in North America is actually 0 degrees. So the blade has no pitch relative to the sleeve. So and you put this in the oar lock, right? You have pin 0, inbuilt pitch on the oar lock, 0 pitch on the blade. You have actually the pitch on the blade eventually as a factor of 3 parts: pin, oar lock, and blade. And since the pin and the blade has 0 degrees, you actually the pitch on the blade is the inbuilt pitch on the oar lock, right? How do you measure this? Well, it's very simple. You take the oar lock off the pin, and then you measure with a pitch meter the pitch on the pin. That's first step, right? Then you choose the proper inserts, right? And the numbers are given on the pitch plugs here itself, right? You have 4, 3, 5, whatever the number is that you like. And then you have to measure it on the oar. And this measurement on the oar is a little bit a tricky one. It is very seldom done because it's a little bit tedious to do, but from my perspective, actually the most important. Nowadays, the boats are so solidly built that the pitch on the pin is very, very well set and very seldomly out of pitch. Only if, let's say, you have an accident, you hit something, then in this case, the pitch would change, and you better talk to someone who can help you to fix this. However, the plates itself actually changes the pitch during a season. The very simple reason is that the way these plates build, they are wrapped in one direction. If you now put a plate in the sun, which is very often in regattas, you have on the one side, you have the sun coming in with the heat. On the other hand, there's low heat. You have a difference there, and the plate actually starts to warp. And therefore, you should actually learn how to pitch your oar. And this is actually done for literally for each plate differently. So I can give you only one here. I used the one from Concept 2, and this is the procedure for the Macon oar, the big plate, or the Smoothie 2 and fat plate, right? And you can find this on their website. You find the same thing from Croker and so on. They give you directions how to do this. And the way to do this is you have to have a block where you put the blade on. And we'll talk about in a minute how you center the block. And you have, on the other hand, another block where you put the handle on to have the oar turned in the way the blade is eventually set with this block on the blade. And then you can obviously measure on the sleeve. So now the trick here is, of course, number one is this block has to be 90 degrees to the middle, the center line of the shaft. So you not only have to find the center line of the shaft, you have also to find a 90 degrees. So how you do this? Well, you take whatever, a square, right? And I did this in our boathouse the other day to show this. Put a square down, and then you draw a 90 degree, right? On the ground. I put this simply on the ground so other people can use it too. Then you place the block exactly to the 90 degrees, and then you have to place the plate properly onto the block. And remember the way it's done here or proposed here, it's 1 inch from the corner to the side of the block where the blade lies on, right? So you have to put 1 inch sticking out from the blade in order to place the blade. And this is how it looks like, right? So you have the block. I use whatever, a square for this, right? On the other hand, another block, put it on there. I put the shaft over the long line of the 90 degrees and the block obviously to the 90 degrees. And then I have to zero my pitch meter, and then I can measure the pitch on the relative plate to the sleeve, right? So get the plate ready, put this on the 90 degree with the two blocks, set the pitch meter, and then you can measure the pitch on the plate. So you can do this with different pitch meters. And I saw in an email, Rebecca uses a very special one that she may want to talk about in a minute. I tend to use this one here, and I cannot remember the name even of it. It's from Buffalo here in New York, a company who does this. Gives me a really nice bubble with degrees, but this is a nice one too. I think it's a Swedish one, right? Where you don't have to do anything. You only have to read the numbers here, right? And you have to set the pitch meter the same way and then measure the pitch on the sleeve. Now, you can do this nowadays also with your smartphone. There are apps, they are free. You can set them here, of course, is that the set is a little bit off. There's a set button where you put this to 0, and then you can measure the pitch on the sleeve. However, and this is now here becomes tricky. The interesting thing is the pitch here changes over the length of the sleeve. So if you look at here at the lower end where the plate is, it's about 2 degrees, right? And now we move this nicely over to the oops, sorry, this was the wrong one. We move this nicely towards the place where the plate is actually, the collar is actually set, right? And see here, you saw the bubble moves already. So at the end here, the pitch was different than here in the middle. And then if you go even further, right? So you see here, it's even another half a degree less. So you have to be very careful because of all these things, of the usage of the blades, of heat differences and so on. You find quite frequently that you have very different pitches on your sleeve. Not only that the pitch is off, but then the sleeve is obviously not really consistent either. So how do you fix this? Well, and this is now the tricky part, and I warn you, be careful, because what you do is actually you shave on the one side off. However, when it's shaved off, it's gone. You have to be a little bit careful. You need to know what you do there. Right, you remember this one side was up there, so you have to shave it down, right? After you shaved it down, and then carefully again, you obviously have at the end, you have to shave more than towards the inboard where it was closer to 0. This means you have to have a little skill and patience to do this. And then in the end, what I always do, I sand it down so we have a nice square sleeve again to row with. So this was a little bit of an introduction in using different ores and deciding which ore you want to use, and then also the problems with the different pitches there. Rebecca, should we now go to the questions there, or should we at first answer current questions?
I think we should do the questions, because trust me, we've got a lot. Thank you, Volker. That was great, and really good to see those little videos of the discrepancies. I'm now actually itching to go and measure my own ores. Let's start with a reasonably straightforward one. Are fat blades suitable for masters?
Of course. Every plate is suitable for master. You can rig any plate for any circumstances. right? I mean, the fat blade obviously has the largest area, so it has to be a shorter oar, right? Maybe the person who asks is wondering about the width of the blade. The fat blade obviously is 2 centimeters wider than, for example, a big blade. And it is obviously a little bit more difficult to row. This I showed this in the comparison where I said the fat blade asks a little bit more for, it's a little bit more finicky to row. And the answer there would be it's up to you, right? If you are happy and want to keep it easy, choose a small blade, choose a big blade. If you want to be a little bit more efficient or row with a more efficient blade, then you have to row with a fat blade. And the point there is, I believe everyone can learn to row with this, right? Because we learned to row, to move from a Macon oar to the big blades. And remember, the Macon oar was way, way, way smaller in width, and the oar was way longer, so it was easier to balance, right? But literally no one, except of this one girl from Switzerland now, who uses Macon oars again, right? No one uses Macon oars anymore. So we learned to row with big blades coming from the Macon oars. Why would you not be able to learn to row with fat blades? Or by the way, the comp blades have the same size as the fat blades.
Yeah. You say no one rows with Macon blades, but the Swiss junior female sculler won the Junior World Championships with Macons this past summer. So some people do, but you're right, definitely in the minority. Another question here is, what is the goal with shorter oars? Is it something to do with pinching? That's from Deb.
Yeah, I mean, again, to explain this 100% takes a little bit longer. You're not this pinching of boats or whatever. It's a very old concept, and it's one of these myths or conspiracy theories that continue to exist, right? I presented this in many papers, in my doctoral, in books, and so on. It is actually the further out you are at the catch, the more efficient your rowing becomes. So if you look, for example, top athletes, top scullers in the world, they row with 75-degree catch angle, right? And are the fastest. They are not the fastest only because they are the strongest, but also because they are able to row these angles and using the most efficient part of the stroke. And the most efficient part of the stroke is the first part of the drive. And therefore, this pinching should be, it's a wrong concept, because the force on the blade is generated not by a drag, most of the time by lift. And now we're becoming very specific, and it's almost would be another presentation to explain this in more detail.
Let's leave that then. So let's go back to the first bit of the question. What's the goal with shorter oars?
The shorter oars are, again, they are simply, you can translate your force that you create on the inboard to a larger force on the outboard. If I explain it very quickly, if you have a oar where the inboard to outboard is 1:2, and you pull on the inboard with, let's say, 100 kilopound or 100 Newton or 100 pound, whatever this is, right? You have 50 pounds or Newton on the blade. And the force on the blade is what accelerates the whole system, right? You understand it? So if you have a 1:2 inboard to outboard and you pull with 100 force on inboard, you get 50 on the blade, and this propels. Now, only to make it very obvious, right? But it's not so easy, right? If you do a 1:1 ratio, so you get a really short oar, and you pull with 100 force on the inboard, you get actually 100 on the blade. So the shorter outboard, the shorter oar, is more efficient. So the trick there is the shorter you can row with the outboard, the faster you can go. But this is obviously tricky. The time in the water gets shorter. It's more tippy. It's more difficult to get the blade in and out of the water. And. The shorter you get, the more difficult it will become to row, and it becomes a little bit of what I call a scissor effect. You make one thing better, you get more efficient, but on the other hand, you make things more complicated and slow down. So there is an optimum where you have to try to find for you, for your skill, for your power, you have to find your proper oar length. And of course, it's a matter of the blade, right? So a fat blade oars are much shorter than, for example, the slick blade.
Good point.
Volker, could you click off your screen sharing? There we go. Great. Now we'll see everybody.
Yeah, I mean, only to encourage a few people, right, to think about. I'm rowing still masters, and I'm not too bad, right? Mike tested this. He was secretly filming me, right, and found out that I'm not so bad, right? I row with 2.70 meter length oars, right? 270 length oars, not 288, right? So I encourage you to try things.
Good points. So on that exact point, Carlos says that you've recommended a bigger oar length difference than the 6 centimeters approximately that concept 2 suggests between the fat 2 and the smoothie. Yeah. Is that part of the same reason?
Yeah. I mean, it's this is a discussion I have very frequently. I'm on the short end of recommendations. So if you hear me, I always recommend really, really, really short. Right. So I believe we can learn to row with short oars. I think it's more efficient and right. Obviously, I also set, like Mike was proposing, I set the span and inboard in a way that I have a really nice long stroke length or arc that I row in the boat. So I set this very consistently, right? Concept 2 is a company that have to make recommendations for a huge variety of people, and they also don't want to lose any customers. If they would use my measurements, people would say, "Oh, you cannot row with these short oars," right? And then they say, "We are going from concept 2 to whatever, Dreher or Croker." So a company like concept 2 or Dreher or Croker, they have to be a little bit more careful with their recommendations. Where I can encourage you to go crazy.
Fill your boots, as they say in New Zealand.
And as I said, right, I mean, I row with 270, right? I mean, if you look the recommendations from concept 2, they are certainly not 270 for fat blades. Says,
do you use fat blades with your 270?
Yes.
Right. Now, a question here about fat blades. How do you set up a boat correctly for fat blades? Do you use the same gearing ratio after selecting a shorter oar length?
I mean, number one is I use the same principles that Mike was already talking about, right? Trying to find the proper inboard and span first for me that I want to row. And then I change the outboard accordingly to get a certain whatever stroke rate possible that I can maintain for a certain length, right? But I have to also remember I would change, for example, in wind condition, I change the outboard too, right? In a headwind, I row even shorter, where in a tailwind, I would lengthen the outboard. I will not change span and inboard anymore, right? So the question was, can you learn to row with? So what am I changing? So the inboard and span is the same for any blade that I would row, right? And I mean, I try, for example, I try the comp blade, I try the the slick blade, I leave always inboard and span the same because I don't want to change my geometry, right? I only change the outboard, right? And the height, I always would rig the oarlock in a way that I can row to the points that you were mentioning, which are, so to speak, the highest you should put the oarlock, right? You should not go higher, right?
Mhm.
Right. So I would always go to the highest point that you were explaining so well in the very beginning of this seminar, right? And that's the highest point I can go. So I'm not changing height either. So all this is the same. The only thing I'm changing is the outboard.
That makes it certainly simpler to adjust, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I think once again, so what I said in the beginning, I would encourage you to simply think logically, right? One step at a time, find your best way of doing it.
Mike, would you like to unmute and join us? And we have a range of questions which are less specific to the individual speakers. And if people are keen to stay on the call, we're happy to stay open. So the first one that we've got here is, have hatchet blades truly made a difference? I have no idea what difference Kenneth Heisler is asking about, but what's your view on this, Mike?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's material. It's the connection with the water. If we looked at positive, the slip in the water, which we've looked at for a long time, and Volker was probably the first to really identify it 40 years ago. If the blade is slipping in the water in a negative direction that the boat is traveling, then then it's just lost effective stroke length. But with a bigger blade, and bigger stroke arcs that they're now using, the blade is actually, or should be actually, moving in the same direction as the boat, and it's like a positive slip, and that all comes from the blade shape and the stroke arc angle.
Great. Max Hunt asks, we use your table from Rowing Faster to setting finish and catch angles, Volker. Do the angles change for masters?
Well, yes and no, right? I mean, it's again, which masters are we talking about, right? For example, if I'm a recreational masters who goes out once a week with his buddies, right, and only wants to have a nice, comfortable row, they don't need to have the same stroke length as if I would try to enter the FISA Masters, where I row against people from all over the world, right? So this is the first decision I have to make. And for a recreational rower, it is not so much the highest speed they can achieve. They want to have a good speed over a long time. So from this perspective, it's a matter, again, the person who asked need to more clarify for which of the scenarios you are planning to go, right? And if you are, let's say, a highly competitive rower and you are a strong woman like Rebecca would be, right? You can use the same kind of lengths that whatever top people in the lightweight women's category row at the World Championships, right? So angles, she would probably row a shorter oar, but the angles would be the same.
Got it.
So, but again, for a recreational rower, or the other thing is then, of course, if depending on your body size, right? I mean, as we said, so when you get older, you get a little bit bigger around your waist. Happened to me, happened to many other people, right? You have to adjust a little bit, and you cannot row the same length and then a fully trained, where a young person, slim person, right? So you have to adjust quite logically.
Got it. Question from Tom Woodman. Is a bigger blade correlated to back injuries? And should masters have more flexible oar shafts? Are there any studies on shaft stiffness and injury rates for masters?
Well, it goes
Arlene
back
might know the answer to this as well.
Well, from my perspective, it's only a matter how you rig your plates. And I see this more often than not, that masters rig their plates too heavy, right? And if you rig too heavy, the probability that you get back problems is higher than if you set it lighter. And this is another reason why I think masters should actually tend to have shorter oars than the longer oars, right? So that's number one. The other thing is the shaft stiffness is there is no, I don't know of any proper scientific study that shows one or the other, right? It's a matter of how you row. If you row a very stiff oar and you are rowing really, let's say you hammer the first part of the stroke, right, and overreach at the catch, well, the probability to get injured is higher, right, than someone who catches really nice and smoothly in the proper length, in the proper speed, and so on, right? So, of course, the probability if you make mistakes is higher with longer, heavier oars and stiffer oars.
I think, Volker, also, I think your chart that you showed in the beginning of your presentation, which showed the qualities of the different efficiencies or the different feel of the shaft of the blade, that's also going to figure into what somebody's musculoskeletal system like, how strong are they, what can they change in their posture, what can they not change in their posture. So I think those absolutely tie into the technique of the blade. I don't think that any blade is inherently prone to injuries. I think it's learning how to match the appropriate stiffness, efficiency, comfort with correct technique, which is why I think so much that masters have to keep getting technical coaching and get analysis on their rigging and get their rigs proper, because that's going to go a long way towards maintaining healthy bodies and rowing better.
Yeah, I mean, we have to also realize with the introduction of the asymmetric plates, right? We reached two things. Number one, a larger plate area, and secondly, it was easier to load up. Yeah. Right? They are actually easier to row.
Yes.
Right? So a beginner or a not as well trained or coached athlete like Marlene was saying, technically not very efficient person, can load much quicker, much harder with the bigger blade. Right? So therefore, again, this is where it's coming from. It is not the blade itself, it's the circumstances in which they are used.
I think that Mike Davenport's pyramid is very instructive on this point. It's more about the athlete and the training environment and the technique and the coaching they're getting before you get to the rigging and the choice of equipment.
Yeah, I mean, you have to realize the rowers that rode the Macon oars before, they were pulling as hard as they could too, right? The problem was it was not so easy.
Right.
Specifically for beginners, right? And this was the increase in back problems. I mean, on top of this, nowadays, in general, competitive rowers train way more, way harder than they did 50 years ago.
That's true. I've got a question here about the setup of your foot stretcher. What's the ratio of heel to seat for a good drive, says Stephen Hall?
I mean, I always start with 18 centimeters, right? And what I do is I promote this concept of the zero measurement, so the middle or normal measurement, right? So if you start and you don't know the boat, you don't know the person, you don't know the technique and so on, right? And I mean the foot stretcher angle plays a role there too, right? 18 centimeters would be the start. Right. And then go ahead.
Let me just chime in on that too. That when I custom rig boats, I set the foot stop height so that the toe is level. The bottom of the toe would be even with the top of the seat. and a very tiny, lightweight woman, for example, who's 5 feet, may have a footstep height of 13 or 14 centimeters because she has size 6 shoes. So this, and unless people are proportionally out of proportion between their shins and their torso, I lean towards the size of the shoe dictates the size, the level, the height of the seat, or the height of the heels.
I mean, we also have to realize in some boats, for example, some singles, you cannot go to 18 centimeters.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah,
Right?
but-
Unless you use seat pads and or, let's say, higher seats, right? So again, what Mike's saying is in the range what I would propose to. You know, you start with, and I would say 18, whatever, right? And then you go the direction, right? Another possibility where Mike is saying, put the toes on the seat, and then you go from there, right? If, let's say, a light woman would not be able then to reach long enough, you would go a little bit down.
Which is a very good point about club boats, which follows on from that. From a short person, should they look at having heel or shoe padding when their foot is much smaller than the size of shoe? Because their heels will consequently be lower in the boat than they would naturally want.
Rebecca, you said it best, is that comfort. Comfort is number one. You're sending a person to do a job for an hour and a half, they better be in a comfortable position.
Well,
I mean, use your logic.
yeah. How often should you change the oar locks?
Well, I change my oar locks always when I get a new boat.
Oh dear, you'd better do it more often than that, unless you get a boat every new year.
Well, I mean, I would say this is you cannot answer this generally, right? This depends on how much the boat is used, right? You see when an oar lock is abused, and specifically the flat part where the sleeve sits on, right, needs to be a flat part. If there are dents or crevices or whatever, then you have to change it. And I mean, an oar lock, I think it's simply $20 or something, this, right? It's very inexpensive, right? Because this is one of these parts that I get used so many times. So I think, but simply when you see wear, definite wear on it, right? And coming back to what Mike Davenport was saying, right? You obviously make sure that you're not wearing so much because you clean your sleeves once in a while or more often.
Right. Rebecca, may I ask my question? I have a question, Volker, or for Volker or Mike. There is a very common issue I find in masters rowing, and I don't know if it's purely by chance, but it tends to affect women more than men, that they have a very difficult time keeping good connection with the foot stretcher. And so I know that what are some of the recommendations that people can look towards in terms of being able to keep that good connection with the foot stretcher in terms of angle? Again, that's a little bit heel placement. And I know that that's sort of a broad question, but I find that this, especially when people get new boats and the angles aren't perhaps set for what fits them, this is often a very common issue with, you know, what to look at with how they adjust their feet and foot stretcher plate.
Poof, this is a loaded question.
I know. Well, it's a difficult
I mean,
issue for some people, right?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing is obviously you want to set the foot stretcher. What I say at first, the zero. If you get into a new boat, set the zero properly, right? So you have to measure the height of the foot stretcher and also the angle. If this is set, so then you are in a good range, right? I think the problem then is that the athlete has to be able to pull properly over the whole drive. So maybe the boat is more unstable, right? Or the wind conditions that may be affecting this. So it becomes more a technical problem rather than a rigging problem.
What is your recommended zero angle for the foot stretcher, Volker?
I mean, I would go at 39, but again, I believe I'm a little bit on the flat side there, right? If you get a boat from the boat builders, there's always set on 42, right? Which I feel a little bit steep, right? I mean, some people like it and can row with it. I mean, this is something to try out. You simply find out how comfortably they get into the catch position, right? Yeah. And again, for masters, I think a little bit flatter is helpful.
I've certainly noticed that some people find it difficult to get their heel down and then to keep the heel down through the midpoint of the drive and actually driving through their heels. That's quite a lot of, occasionally I've found people who pretty much stay on the ball of their foot, which isn't advantageous in terms of power application.
Yeah, I mean, that's another loaded point. We can talk a long time about this. I never, ever coach heels down. The very simple reason is no, because if the boat is properly set, the rower gets down with the heel at their proper timing, right? Only if, let's say, there are some rigging problems, or you see this sometimes on an ergometer where people can overreach very easily, then you'll find is that they stay on the front foot. I must say, I never ever experienced that someone would not get the heels down if the foot stretcher is set properly.
So Pat Tyrone and Bob O'Prandy, that's your answer for the degree of the foot stretcher for the less flexible ankle.
Well, this is another point. You know, I think this is a myth. It's a myth with the flexible ankle. You know, in rowing, you don't need to be flexible, period. You think about at the catch position, you don't need to have flexible ankles. You only have to need a flexible ankle if you demand that the person gets the heel down right at the catch. And this is old style coaching.
You have to. I don't demand it at the catch. Sorry, that's no,
we don't demand it, right? Yeah, and actually, right. And Dr. Stuart McGill would agree with that as well. That no, on the contrary, we want some degree of stiffness for more impact versus absorption.
Exactly. If you look at sprinters, right? Sprinters who run the fastest, they run on the balls of the feet, not on the heels. Yeah. If you get the heel down, you get slow.
Absolutely. And you know, it's the same thing with shoulders, right? I like to tell my athletes, we want to pull you together and connect you. We don't want to pull you apart and disconnect you.
Yeah.
Well, Volker and Mike, I think this has been wonderful. I think it will be extremely valuable for our athletes. I know I'm going to go back and listen to it again because there are definitely some very valuable tidbits of information in here and to absorb it. And for our listeners, do go back. By this evening, the video will be posted in the lessons so that you can access it. You have lifetime access to it. So you can go back and listen to this. And also there'll be the information about how to get in touch with Mike Purser if you're interested in the video rigging analysis, and about Volker's book, Masters Rowing, which is an excellent book. So we want to encourage everybody to get a copy of the book. And for Mike Davenport's contact as well. Rebecca, I think you did a wonderful job. And I think it sounds like we've got over time, it sounds like we've got some really good topics that we can dig into a little bit more over time. So I'd like to thank everyone and
thank you guys for setting this up. Wonderful.
Yeah, excellent. Great job you guys are doing.
Thank you. And we're honored that you would be our guest. So we certainly hope that we'll see you again and we can keep getting masters rowers rowing faster. How's that?
Here we go. I like this topic, rowing faster.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. I don't know if I can get. us
Stop the
out of-
recording first, Marlene.
Yes, I will. Just a moment, everybody. Thank you.